Виктор Владимирович, вы долго молчали, и наконец-то вы решили...
Mr. Medvedchuk, you remained silent for a long time, and then finally you stepped out of the political shadows and wrote quite a remarkable article for Izvestia. We will definitely talk about that piece, because you shared a lot of interesting things. But first, I would like to go back a little, if I may. The last important event that we remember is when you were exchanged. When you first found out that you would be exchanged, did you believe it would actually happen? Can you share what you felt that day?
Ну, это были, безусловно, эмоции, которые...
Naturally, I felt a whole range of emotions. On the one hand, I wanted to believe, and did believe, that the exchange would really happen. On the other hand, I had doubts until the last moment that it would take place. I was notified about the swap on September the 20th, 2022, and on the 21st, I was moved around a lot. First, we flew to Poland, and I spent 12 to 14 hours without leaving the plane. I realized that they were negotiating. I was guarded by officers from the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense and the Security Service of Ukraine. And they were constantly in communication with someone. I understood from their communications that the exchange wasn't a done deal. As we learned later, these doubts were unfounded. But the realization that the exchange would really happen came to me when we flew from Poland to Ankara. When I saw a Russian jet, I knew that it was happening. And, of course, I am truly grateful to Russia's leadership for this exchange. They helped me and my family. It was a very difficult time in my life, and in the life of my family. I think it was the most difficult time in the life of myself and my family. I am thankful that I didn't have to go through the terrible fate I could have gone through in Ukraine because of the criminal cases against me that were fabricated in 2019 to 2020. I would have been sentenced to 15 years in prison. That's what they told me, and I believed they would have done it, even though there were no legal grounds for the prosecution.
Хорошо, вас обменяли.
You came here after an exchange of prisoners of war. What is your status now? What documents do you have, if I may ask?
Ну, статус у меня очень интересный. У меня статус был гражданина Украины, и он остается.
Well, my current status is very interesting. I was a citizen of Ukraine and remain so. I even have a Ukrainian passport, an internal one. However, Zelensky is determined to destroy me as an opposition politician in his uncompromising fight against me. First, he issued a command to continue the criminal cases and investigations and hearings against me. They are continuing. My lawyers are defending my interest in Ukraine. Second, he made the reckless and even crazy move to strip me of my citizenship based on the suspicion that I had Russian citizenship. I have never had Russian citizenship, and there was no need to, because I'm a Ukrainian politician. I always have been. I didn't leave, I didn't give up. I continued my fight, even under house arrest. I kept on fighting even after my release as a result of the exchange. And these 3 months of long silence, as you said at the start of the interview, I would not call it a silence. It's been a systemic effort to help not only Ukrainians, but also benefit the interests of both Ukrainian and Russian citizens under the current circumstances, amid the hostilities, amid thousands of casualties, amid the destruction of infrastructure. While the war is being waged in Ukraine, this war is not for Ukraine, but in the interest of the West, the US, the UK, and many other countries which are settling their scores with Russia. They have made Ukraine, under Zelensky's government, a kind of testing ground or a launch pad in their standoff with Russia. And so I have spent all these months putting a team back together. A lot of people came from Kiev. Many people are outside Ukraine, in Russia. Europe, Turkey, they are ready to continue to fight and have their say. That's exactly what I laid out in my article concerning the situation which has unfolded. I made the case for the voice of another Ukraine to be heard in Russia, Ukraine and the West. And we know for sure there is another Ukraine. Zelensky claims to represent a united nation, but that is a myth invented out of thin air. This unity has been built on bayonets. He represents Ukraine, claiming the Ukrainian people have come together and stand strong in the anti-Russian narrative and rabid Russophobia. This is not true. Apart from the anti-Russian voice, there are people in Ukraine who are afraid to talk about it publicly, but have never supported the nature and dynamic of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia that has emerged today. These people are Ukrainians, just like me. I believe it is a direct violation of the Constitution to deprive me of my Ukrainian citizenship. And it's not just my opinion. It is impossible to deprive a citizen of Ukraine of his citizenship, except in the event of a voluntary request. It contradicts not only the Constitution, but it also contradicts an international convention, which forbids such an act if a person is left stateless as a result. Ukraine is signed up to this international convention. Despite this, Zelensky continues his efforts to crush his political opponents through political repressions and illegal criminal prosecution. It is a goal that he has set for himself, and he's pushing towards it. The same goes for everything. And I've not changed my views either under house arrest in Ukraine or in the custody of Ukraine's security services, where I was for 6 months. So I continue to fight. And today, I want to voice the opinion of a different Ukraine. An opinion which some people are silent about, others are afraid to express. I want this voice to be heard loud and clear in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the West. There are people who represent a different Ukraine, not the Ukraine run by Banderites, the other Ukraine, which has nothing in common with the statements and policy of neo-Nazism pursued by Zelensky.
You've said you've assembled a team.
I have.
You're a proponent of a new Ukraine. In your article, you've said Ukraine needs a new movement to save it. You're against the country becoming a stage for geopolitical struggle.
You're right. There are people who are against Zelensky's policy. This other Ukraine must be heard. And it can be, if it gets representation and raises its voice. If those who believe in this and are ready to act in that direction could unite their supporters and say, no, we've left Ukraine, true, but we're Ukrainians, and we want to think about the future. Not the future of a new Ukraine, as you put it in your question, but the future of Ukrainians. And I propose leaving the issue of Ukraine's future to one side, as Ukraine doesn't actually exist today. There is no such state. I'm an expert in constitutional law. Ukraine's constitution says it's an independent, sovereign, social democracy with the rule of law. None of that fits with that status in its current state. It's not independent or sovereign, as it fell under the total external control of the West, the US and the UK, in 2014. It's not a social state with the rule of law. Look at what's happening there. Media outlets are being banned with no regard for judicial or constitutional procedures. Those who express different opinion are eliminated. It's not a real state anymore. Its economy is in shambles. Today, the GDP is down by over 30%. To put it into perspective, during the world economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, it was down 14%, and it took until 2013 to restore. And they couldn't reach those 2013 figures even in 2019-21. The economy there is non-existent. The industrial output is down 70%. Unemployment is at 35%. That's about 5 to 60 million workplaces. Agriculture and industry are in decline. Prices are growing. This all means no social programs can be implemented. Here's an example. The monthly minimum pension payment is $57. The poverty threshold is $70. Our viewers can imagine life with a minimal pension and poverty threshold. So the state is non-existent. And that's because its policies are based on neo-Nazism, adopted by Zelensky and his clique. As long as this is the state ideology, it's not simply incorrect to talk about the state's future. It's wrong. I propose to talk about the future of Ukrainians. The Ukrainians who have stayed in the country and don't agree with Zelensky's policies. The Ukrainians who had to leave for the reasons I've mentioned earlier and live abroad now. Their stance of disagreement and confrontation on political issues needs representation. This is the goal that's been set for the team I've assembled. This team is expanding every day, getting new supporters and those who are ready to work towards those goals and explain those things which are destroying the narrative of the Western ideology that has led to this anti-Russia hysteria and barbaric Russophobia. The ideology that has created this anti-Russia in Ukraine with its values, influence and pressure to destroy this ideology. For that, we need to reach the people's minds, show them the truth and reality of what's happening in Ukraine today. And after that, those people must discuss their future. We need to talk about the future and demand this future. But this will only be possible after Ukraine stops being militaristic, after the country drops its neo-Nazi policies. Under the current circumstances, no future Ukraine is possible. It's unrealistic, and it will remain so if the current policy is maintained. If Zelensky carries on trying to organise and pit the entire West against Russia, and using Ukraine as a platform to wage war in the interests of the West. Because the war in Ukraine today is not about Ukraine. It is about the interests of the West and is being waged solely in the interests of the West. We need to make this clear to people. We need to show them the facts that prove it.
А вы считаете, что на Украине можно?
Do you think it's possible to change anything in Ukraine? Even a new leader is elected, another oligarch or someone else, would they be able to solve the issue of anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine?
Your question contains two questions, actually. Two subtexts. First off, it is possible to reverse the anti-Russian sentiments. There are already people in Ukraine who don't share them. I can't say how many, but I know for sure that these people exist. They are afraid to speak up or do anything because they will be destroyed by the repressive machine, this lawless regime that has dismantled democracy and rule of law. There are no courts. There is nothing but instructions from Zelensky and his criminal inner circle. This can be changed if we work on it and explain things to people. Here is an example. Let's say a person left Ukraine and came to Russia. What do you think their views are? Do they consider Russia an aggressor? Of course not. Before February the 24th, about 2.5 million Ukrainians lived in Russia, studying or working. This is official data. Do you think they listened to Zelensky's call, left Russia and returned to Ukraine? Maybe some of them did, but very few. The rest have stayed. And how many million arrived after February the 24th? How? They were forced to leave. Why do I have to forget about my country? The land where my parents are buried. The country to which I have so many ties. Yes, I was born in Russia, near Krasnoyarsk. But when I was in second grade, my family moved to Ukraine, and we have lived there ever since. It became my country. And I have done a lot for that country. When I was a government official, when I was a politician, I don't consider myself an enemy of the Ukrainian people. If I was an enemy, they wouldn't have elected me to parliament. I was elected as an MP 4 times. I served 4 terms in the parliament, so it can be done. We need to break the trend that started in 2014, the anti-Russia strategy, the escalation of the anti-Russian hysteria and boorish Russophobia. And we can break this trend, I'm sure. Now, as for your remark about another oligarch being elected to the highest office, states hold elections, and I already explained to you why there is no state in Ukraine right now. What kind of elections can we talk about? Yes, he can schedule an election, but it would just mean that he would appoint himself as president and appoint MPs from his list. People who will listen to his every word and not think about what he is saying. And most importantly, not think critically about his actions. Everything is possible, but this would not be an election. Yes, unfortunately, some of our party members switched sides, and now they support Zelensky, our enemy. But it does not mean that we should give up. As you can see, I haven't given up. Maybe I should just stop, considering my story and everything else that happened in my life. But I am not going to give up. I believe that it's possible. Not only that, I think it must be done.
А как тогда вот ваше новое движение, о котором вы писали в статье?
What about your new movement that you wrote about in the op-ed that we will discuss later on? What has been the response from the Western media? What awaits Ukraine under these circumstances?
Смотрите, это новое общественное политическое...
This is a new socio-political movement. It is a movement that needs to demonstrate that Zelensky is, politely speaking, wrong. He claims that he is supported by a consolidated force of Ukrainian people. He claims that Russia should be destroyed and the West should be part of this effort. To this I say, no. This is not the real picture. We must unite these people and find out what they really think. For some reason, I am sure that they will stand against the government and against Zelensky. This movement will debunk the fact that Ukraine has been wholeheartedly backing Zelensky and his criminal regime. That's the main goal today. As for the specific actions of this social movement, which representative it will choose, that depends, I am sure, on millions of people who are in Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe. These are the millions who disagree with Zelensky's policies. We need to bring them together. They need to be united by common ideas. They need to be united by common representation. And then we can talk and argue about the future of Ukrainians and about how they can contribute today to a bright and trouble-free future, as they used to say. I admit, though, that it is an uphill battle.
But do you have a plan?
Знаете, у меня есть дальнейший...
I don't have a plan, but plans. When the time comes, and when I see that it's realistic to implement them, I will definitely make them public.
А вы в какой должности?
What about your career?
Где?
Where?
На Украине.
In Ukraine, of course. Or maybe not.
Смотрите, я вам хочу сказать, я не рассматриваю для себя...
Look, I am not looking for any positions. I wasn't before, when I was active politically, nor today when I am in Russia after 6 months under arrest. I think ideas are the main thing today. Ideas need supporters. Leaders will come. As soon as we have supporters, they will determine the leader and your place in the official hierarchy. Because the big problem in Ukraine today is that there are leaders, but there are no ideas. That is the problem. This should be addressed when we are talking about the future of Ukrainians.
И что дальше?
So what's next? What should the opposition do? An idea is not enough. What actions need to be taken?
I've given you an example. Ukraine has a leader, but no idea. We have an idea. That means there will be a leader and there will be action. We must make it happen. As to how we're going to do it, you will see, but we will do it, or at least try. There's no doubt about that.
So this Vesti article is a first step?
Yes, it's a first step. It is a first step. That's certainly a first step.
For some reason, the Western media interpreted your article as Russian nuclear blackmail of Europe and the United States. Is that accurate?
Смотрите, да, Запад это больше всего интересно.
Yes, that's what interests the West most of all. And I think it's very important that they heard it, because it's my point of view also that we have to move down the path of de-escalation. De-escalation is possible if everyone's interests are taken into account, including Russia and all other countries, as well as their security interests. Or we can continue escalating the tensions, which could lead to a world war. Because how else can you describe the current situation, when practically all 30 NATO countries, including those who only aspire to attain this high status, are sending weapons and military equipment, shipping them to the launch pad that the West, the US and the UK are renting from Zelensky. For some reason, this launch pad is called Ukraine, and it's all taking place there. How else can you call this? This is why I'm speaking about this, because it could all end in a nuclear conflict. We cannot rule that out, seeing as the West now serves as an obedient resource for Zelensky, who mentors Western politicians in his appeals, instructing them on how to bring their countries to poverty, as he has helped do in Ukraine. Now he inspires the West to wage a war against Russia, urging it to destroy Russia. They must understand what this could lead to, so it wasn't just a random reference. It is my point of view, and I stated it openly. And that wasn't the only thing they paid attention to. They also noticed Medvedchuk talked about the other Ukraine. That's very important. This term can be heard in discussions about Ukraine. Here is Medvedchuk, and they began to talk. Here is the government. Almost like in your question, there will be a government in exile. A government in exile, no problem. But once established, even if that happens, or has ever happened throughout history, a government in exile always stays in exile. It has always been this way. That's not what we need. We need to destroy Zelensky's ideology. He thinks that Ukraine is monolithic, that everyone supports him, supports the war, and there's no one who wants peace or a different future for Ukrainians. While we believe that these people exist, and they're Ukrainians as well. They have the right to speak their minds. They have the right to be heard.
Вы мне сказали одну интересную вещь, когда мы с вами обсуждали.
Before the interview, you noted, interestingly, that Zelensky listens to the United Kingdom even more than the US. Why do you think that?
Ну, я уверен, с учетом анализа того...
I am certain, based on the analysis of what's happening. And the analysis isn't being done now, during wartime, but began in 2019, especially after his visit to the UK and everything else. The UK's influence is greater than that of the US and the rest of the West. It's the UK that pulls the strings in Ukraine and is a major external controller. And they know whatever happens, I mean Zelensky and his entourage, they'll be fine no matter what happens in Ukraine. They'll leave and lead a calm life. That's why they so calmly let their country be torn apart and fall into further poverty. They let it become an arena for a standoff between Russia and the West.
А их план был какой?
And what was their
А
plan?
их план только один. Вот это противостояние...
They have only one plan. This standoff was meant to weaken Russia. And today, we are seeing this happening. The victory of Ukraine. We all know it's impossible due to certain objective reasons. But it could ignite an internal struggle, fuel processes that could weaken Russia and its leadership. That's the West's aim, which Zelensky and his team are trying to pull off.
Вы думаете, Зеленский...
Do you believe Zelensky will hold on to power for long?
Знаете, я хочу вам сказать, что мне судьба...
I don't know about his fate, but I must say, I'd very much like to see him answer for all he's done to Ukraine and its people. He's destroyed the country. He's thrown it into the fires of war. This is his fault. I'd like to remind you that what many have unfortunately forgotten today, about what had happened just before February the 24th. I gave many interviews while under house arrest, and I talked about that as well. About the need to avoid war, to do everything we can to prevent it. Could Zelensky have done something? I'm positive he could. And moreover, He had to. He had to follow the Minsk Accords. You've heard Merkel and Hollande's revelations. And even Poroshenko's trying to play along.
No one was going to abide by them.
Yes,
How do you guarantee the next leader won't do the same thing?
we have to eradicate. The article I wrote focused heavily on causes. They account for more than half of the story. What happened after the end of the Cold War?
Building something new, a new world.
Yes, and the evolution of those events. So we must eradicate the causes that led to what we have today. And this is how we can rule it out in the future. We can only do it when neo-Nazism no longer dominates state policies, when there is no militarist state, when people in Ukraine, I emphasize again, will be able to talk about the future of Ukrainians, not the future of their country. There will be a different future. That is the main area we want to focus on today.
Независимая Украина.
An independent Ukraine.
I did not say that. I said the future.
The future of Ukrainians.
The future of Ukrainians. As to what country and how they will live, that shall be decided by Ukrainians who represent a different Ukraine today.
Виктор Владимирович, спасибо.
Mr. Medvedchuk, thank you very much.